In the hidden corners of 20th century history lie stories erased, redacted, and buried beneath decades of silence. They are the sealed files that neither victors nor vanquished wished to see the light of day, the fragments of testimony whispered in interrogation chambers, and the coded signals intercepted but never fully explained. For every battle fought in daylight, there were shadow operations concealed in secrecy, convoys that vanished without wreckage, prisons that never officially existed, and pacts signed under flickering lanterns between sworn enemies. The Second World War was not only a clash of armies, it was a contest of deception, betrayal, and hidden agendas recorded in intelligence reports stamped "For command eyes only." From the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, from the bunker corridors of Berlin to the dim offices of Moscow's Lubyanka, the war generated mysteries that resist explanation, even in the age of declassification. Survivors spoke in broken voices of orders that made no sense, of comrades who disappeared overnight, and of documents stamped with codenames so obscure they remain unsolved. Decades later, when fragments of Gestapo files, Soviet NKVD interrogations, and Allied decrypts began to surface, they revealed patterns of silence and erasure, a deliberate effort to conceal events too dangerous or destabilizing for the official record. These are not legends or folklore, but the unfinished footnotes of a war whose full dimensions remain locked away in state vaults. Each story lingers like an echo in the archives, daring us to open the forbidden folders and confront the truths our leaders swore must never be spoken. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Operation Iron Wolf. The winter of 1945 was a season of collapse for the Third Reich. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly across East Prussia, and the Baltic Sea, once dominated by the Kriegsmarine, had become a corridor of desperation. Amid this chaos, a convoy identified in scattered German records as Operation Iron Wolf departed from the port of Pillau in late February. 6 vessels, a mixture of cargo ships and auxiliary escorts, slipped into the icy waters under orders written in the sharp, mechanical language of the Oberkommando der Marine. Their mission was officially described as the evacuation of material and personnel, but subsequent Allied decrypts, Soviet interrogation transcripts, and surviving fragments of German correspondence suggest something far more sinister. The convoy carried not only civilians and officers, but also sealed crates, heavily guarded compartments, and an unusual roster of passengers that included SS personnel and high-ranking party officials. Eyewitness accounts from the time described the loading operations with unease. Local civilians recalled the harsh floodlights cutting across the snowbound docks, illuminating steel containers marked with cryptic symbols rather than standard shipping designations. Men in black SS uniforms oversaw the process, carrying sidearms and issuing threats to dock workers. Some claimed to have glimpsed paintings, statues, and gilded objects hastily crated and loaded, remnants of looted art stripped from occupied Eastern Europe. Others remembered smaller, carefully sealed cases, carried by teams of guards who never spoke a word. These cases were marked with labels in red ink, accompanied by the double lightning bolt insignia of the Schutzstaffel, and entered into no official manifest. The Allied listening stations at Bletchley Park intercepted irregular Enigma traffic during this same period. Messages referred cryptically to cargo not for Moscow, and urgent signals were sent from Berlin requesting confirmation of the convoy's safe passage. Yet these intercepts broke off suddenly, and despite frantic attempts by codebreakers to reconstruct the chain of communication, no further information was received after the convoy left Pillau. The ships were never reported to have reached their intended destination, believed to be Kiel or possibly occupied Denmark. No wreckage was found, no survivors were pulled from the frozen sea, and no Allied or Soviet naval reports confirmed their destruction. It was as though 6 vessels and everyone aboard simply vanished into the Baltic mist. In Soviet archives opened briefly in the 1990s after the collapse of the USSR, a number of NKVD and naval intelligence documents reference the mystery in passing. Search grids were drawn up for the region between Pillau and Bornholm, and submarine patrol logs describe oral anomalies in sonar recordings during the nights following the convoy's departure. No debris fields were recovered. Dragnet operations continued for several weeks, but reports conclude with the stark statement, "No contact. Convoy presumed disappeared." Interestingly, these documents were filed not under naval operations but in a section marked with the internal NKVD code for sensitive political materials, suggesting that Moscow considered the case too delicate to be treated as a simple wartime loss. Testimonies, Gathered in later years from East Prussian, villagers add another dimension of unease. Several inhabitants of small fishing towns near Pillau claimed they had heard muffled explosions far offshore, followed by silence. Some insisted they saw flames on the horizon that quickly vanished, as though extinguished unnaturally fast. Yet these same witnesses emphasized that no wreckage washed ashore in the following days, an anomaly considering the usual debris after maritime destruction. Survivors from Wehrmacht, rear units retreating through the area, recalled being warned by officers not to speak of the convoy, under threat of immediate arrest. One of the most haunting aspects of Operation Iron Wolf lies in its passenger list. Surviving fragments from German personnel files mention several SS officers attached to the convoy, including individuals linked to advanced weapons research under the Reich's clandestine programs. References to V-bis shipments, believed to indicate experimental components of the V2 rocket program, appear in two fragmentary notes recovered from destroyed archives in Königsberg. British intelligence later speculated that the convoy might have been transporting weapons prototypes or uranium oxide, intended for continued development of atomic research. If true, this would explain the unusually high-level interest from both Berlin and Moscow in the convoy's fate. Equally enigmatic are hints that high-ranking party officials were aboard. Rumors in Allied intelligence circles suggested that one of Hitler's trusted aides, possibly linked to Himmler's staff, intended to escape via the Baltic. Yet the lack of conclusive documentation leaves this theory unresolved. What is certain is that Berlin requested status updates from Pillau repeatedly after the convoy's departure, and when none were forthcoming, the inquiries ceased abruptly. The silence from higher command after early March 1945 is chilling in itself, as though the matter had been deliberately erased. By 1947, both Western and Soviet intelligence agencies had investigated the disappearance, yet their files closed with unusual speed. In British records, the matter appears under Foreign Office correspondence marked unresolved, no further inquiry. In Soviet documentation, entire sections are blacked out, leaving only headings like Convoy Iron Wolf, political significance undisclosed. American intelligence, newly organized under the CIA, requested access to British and Soviet material but was denied. Internal memos from Langley note conspicuous suppression of data by both powers, an assessment that has fueled speculation ever since. Why was this convoy so important, and what justified the joint silence? Some historians suggest the cargo consisted of looted cultural treasures of immeasurable value, stolen from Poland, the Baltic states, and Soviet museums, and destined either for concealment or for negotiation in the event of Germany's collapse. Others argue that the more likely explanation lies in weapons technology, prototypes, or nuclear materials that could shift the post-war balance of power. Yet the most unsettling theory points to a darker bargain between German and Soviet authorities, an exchange erased from the official record because it threatened the carefully constructed narrative of absolute enmity. The wrecks themselves have never been found. Numerous expeditions have searched the Baltic seabed, particularly in the waters north of Kaliningrad and around Bornholm, but sonar sweeps reveal only silence. Some suggest the ships were scuttled deliberately in deep waters, far from common shipping lanes, their cargo buried in darkness. Others believe they were intercepted by Soviet submarines and sunk, their remains concealed by subsequent disinformation campaigns. Without wreckage, the truth remains intangible, lost to both time and the cold, shifting currents of the Baltic. What makes Operation Iron Wolf so enduring is not merely its disappearance, but the collective effort to erase its memory. 6 ships, dozens of officers, and cargo of unknown but evidently immense significance vanished without trace, and within 2 years, every major intelligence power had closed its file. The silence that followed was not born of ignorance, but of choice. Somewhere in the sealed vaults of Moscow, London, or Washington, fragments may still exist, locked under classification beyond the reach of historians. Until they are opened, the convoy remains one of the Baltic's darkest enigmas, a shadow in the archives that refuses to fade. Chapter 2. Gestapo File Number 17. The Shadow Prison in the ruins of Berlin during the final weeks of April 1945. Allied soldiers combed through the shattered offices of the Gestapo headquarters. Among the burned fragments, scattered files, and hastily destroyed ledgers, one folder carried a number that would puzzle investigators for decades. File number 17, Sonderlager. The word Sonderlager translates simply as special camp, but its context in Gestapo records was always loaded with dread. These were not ordinary prisons or labor camps. Sonderlager were facilities reserved for high-value prisoners, subjects of particular interest to Himmler's inner circle, or individuals connected to secret projects. Yet file number 17 was different. Unlike other files, it contained almost no administrative detail, no transport lists, no routine paperwork, no names of guards or commandants. Instead, there were only cryptic memoranda, half-legible reports, and a handful of testimonies that suggested the existence of a detention site so secret that its very mention was suppressed. Even within the Reich's most feared institution, the location most often referenced is the Harz Mountains, a rugged region in central Germany riddled with caves, tunnels, and abandoned mines. These mountains had already hosted some of the Reich's most desperate late-war projects, including underground factories where prisoners constructed jet aircraft and rockets under appalling conditions. Yet the hints in file number 17 point not to industrial use, but to something darker. A single sheet, dated March 1944, and signed by an officer of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, notes: subject delivery complete, facility operational, further acknowledgement by direct channel only. The file bore the seal of Section 4B4, the notorious department responsible for Jewish affairs under Adolf Eichmann, but the language suggested something beyond deportations. What prisoners were delivered, and for what purpose, remains unknown. OSS cables intercepted in late 1944 referred cryptically to a black prison with no return. These reports came from agents operating in Switzerland who claimed their German contacts spoke of a subterranean site where individuals disappeared without trace. Names mentioned included captured British commandos, suspected Soviet intelligence officers, and even German officers who had fallen under suspicion of disloyalty. The fact that the Gestapo would confine its own personnel in such a place highlights the fearsome secrecy surrounding the facility. Allied intelligence could never verify the exact location, yet the consistency of the references suggested that something was indeed buried beneath the Harz. After the war, Soviet Smersh units conducted thorough searches of the Harz Mountains. In 1946, a Soviet report later declassified in the 1970s described the discovery of underground tunnels lined with sealed iron doors. These doors were welded shut from the outside, and attempts to cut through them revealed only empty chambers coated with soot, as if fire had been used to obliterate their contents. No prisoners were found, no records discovered. The Soviets removed several crates of documents from the area, but their fate remains unknown, marked simply as material destroyed 1953 in surviving KGB indexes. Whatever was inside those tunnels, Moscow considered it too dangerous to preserve. The testimonies that survive are fragmentary and chilling. One account came from a captured SS officer interrogated by American forces in 1945. He described escorting a group of prisoners to a mountain fortress near Nordhausen, though he could not or would not give precise coordinates. According to his statement, the prisoners were never seen again, and the guards were rotated out after only weeks, sworn to silence under threat of death. Another testimony, smuggled from a former Gestapo clerk, spoke of experiments in silence and endurance. Though the vague phrasing leaves much to interpretation, some historians believe this may have referred to chemical or psychological trials, as German research into nerve agents such as tabun and sarin was advancing rapidly during this period. Others suspect it pointed to interrogation methods designed to break spies and resistance leaders in ways never officially acknowledged. No photographs survive. File number 17 contains only crude sketches, pencil-drawn outlines of tunnels and barred doors, as if copied from memory by someone forbidden from carrying a camera. These sketches show narrow passageways descending deep into rock, with symbols indicating air shafts and heavy blast doors. In one corner of a drawing, the word Versuch appears, German for experiment. The meaning of this word in context is unknown. Was it a reference to weapons tests, to medical procedures, or to psychological conditioning? Without corroborating documents, the truth is speculation. Western intelligence took the matter seriously in the immediate post-war years. Declassified CIA memoranda from 1948 discuss Gestapo detention site in Harz, non-existent objective. This curious phrasing reflects the paradox. The facility was rumored, referenced, and feared, yet it officially did not exist. Analysts noted the absence of logistical records. All concentration camps, even the most secret, left some paper trail of transports, guard rotations, and requisitions. The shadow prison, if it existed, was uniquely invisible. Such silence suggested that it operated outside normal chains of command, perhaps under Himmler's personal direction or within the authority of the SS's secretive Ahnenerbe Research Institute. The question remains, what happened to those who entered its gates? No survivors have ever come forward, no graves identified, no prisoner list discovered. If captured Allied operatives were truly confined there, their fate has never been explained. For the families of missing commandos and resistance fighters, the shadow prison represents a void, a place where loved ones were swallowed by history and erased from all records. Even German families whispered about officers who vanished after being accused of disloyalty, with rumors that they had been taken into the mountain, never to return. The deliberate suppression of evidence deepens the mystery. Allied forces, Soviet investigators, and post-war German authorities all had reasons to conceal what they found. If the site was used for experimental trials involving nerve agents, its discovery would have implicated both the Reich and, potentially, the victors who later exploited German scientific knowledge. Operation Paperclip and its Soviet equivalents sought to harvest Nazi expertise for Cold War advantage. Acknowledging the full scope of Gestapo experimentation would have risked public outrage and undermined these clandestine recruitment programs. Thus, silence prevailed. By the 1950s, references to file number 17 vanished from public discourse. When scholars later examined the Gestapo archives, they found gaps where the file should have been. Some suggest it was destroyed deliberately during the Nuremberg trials to avoid complicating prosecutions. Others believe it was transferred into classified NATO or KGB archives, buried under multiple layers of secrecy. What remains are only the fragments, the sketch of tunnels, the testimony of terrified clerks, and the memory of welded iron doors deep beneath the Harz Mountains. The shadow prison is a reminder of the lengths to which totalitarian regimes will go to bury their crimes. Unlike Auschwitz, Dachau, or Buchenwald, it was not meant to be seen, not meant to leave a trace. It was a place erased before it could even be recorded, its victims stripped not only of life but of history itself. In that sense, it stands as one of the darkest enigmas of the war, a facility that never existed, yet left an indelible scar on those who brushed against its silence. The mountains keep their secrets, and the iron doors remain closed, welded against intrusion, as if the Reich intended its ghosts to remain entombed forever. Chapter 3. The Silent Guns of Gotenhafen. In January 1945, the Baltic port of Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia in northern Poland, was a landscape of desperation. Operation Hannibal, the largest seaborne evacuation in history, was underway. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians sought escape from the advancing Red Army, cramming into any vessel capable of floating. Amid the chaos of embarkation, the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine relied heavily on Gotenhafen's formidable coastal artillery batteries to secure the evacuation corridors. These were hardened emplacements of heavy-caliber guns, constructed years earlier to repel any Soviet advance by sea. Yet as Soviet naval units pressed closer, an inexplicable silence fell upon the defenses. Despite being fully armed, supplied, and manned, the guns of Gotenhafen failed to fire. Survivors of the evacuation remembered the eerie stillness. As columns of ships pushed through the night waters under freezing gales, the horizon remained unlit by the thunder of German coastal fire. Soviet commanders later reported their astonishment at encountering virtually no resistance from the batteries that should have dominated the shoreline. Declassified Soviet naval logs note, with dry understatement, passage uncontested, enemy batteries inactive. Allied intelligence reviewing captured German documents after the war was equally perplexed. The artillery positions had not been destroyed. Ammunition remained stacked in bunkers. Gun barrels were intact. Yet not a single documented salvo was fired during the critical days of evacuation. Interrogations of captured German officers in the years following the war only deepened the mystery. Some insisted the order had come directly from Berlin, a stand-down command, inexplicable given the desperate situation. Others swore that their men were prepared to fight but found the batteries already abandoned, uniforms neatly folded, helmets stacked, and ammunition untouched. The stories conflicted, but the imagery was consistent. defenses left behind in an orderly, deliberate fashion, as though the gunners had vanished into thin air. The files that survived in Kriegsmarine archives contain fragments hinting at deeper unease. A situation report dated 25 January 1945 from the Naval Command in Gotenhafen notes, "Unexplained absence of assigned personnel from Battery Südwall. Investigation pending." The report ends abruptly with the notation, "Further inquiry unnecessary by higher authority." This suppression suggests intervention from outside normal chains of command, as if Berlin sought to erase the incident before questions could arise. For a regime that thrived on meticulous record-keeping, the absence of follow-up is startling. By 1952, NATO analysts reviewing declassified Soviet reports noted references to auditory disturbances among German crews stationed near the silent batteries. These disturbances were described in vague but troubling terms: whispers, disembodied voices, and the sound of commands being given by no identifiable officer. Such accounts were dismissed officially as battlefield hysteria, yet they recur in multiple testimonies across different sources. Men claimed they heard instructions telling them to abandon their posts, orders not recorded in any written communication. Whether these were hallucinations, psychological collapse, or something more sinister remains unknown. Adding to the mystery, the few surviving soldiers from Gotenhafen's defenses told conflicting stories after the war. One veteran, interrogated by the Polish security services in 1946, stated that his battery had been ordered to hold fire until recognition of friendly passage. When pressed, he could not explain who gave the order or why it was never countermanded, even as Soviet warships advanced unhindered. Another survivor, questioned decades later by a German historian, claimed simply that the men disappeared overnight. He described finding bunks made, boots polished and rifles stacked neatly against the wall, but no trace of the crews themselves. His testimony ended with a chilling statement. It was as if the sea had called them. The absence of action by the batteries had strategic consequences. Soviet naval forces entered the port approaches with minimal resistance, hastening the collapse of German defensive lines and placing immense pressure on the evacuation routes. The tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff, sunk on 30 January 1945 with over 9,000 lives lost, remains the most infamous episode of Operation Hannibal. Yet the silence of the Gotenhafen guns, days earlier, contributed to the vulnerability of the evacuation flotillas. Had the batteries fired, they might have slowed the Soviet advance, bought time, or deterred attacks. Instead, their silence left thousands of refugees exposed. Post-war speculation has centered on three main theories. The first suggests sabotage, possibly by German officers disillusioned with the regime, or even by infiltrated Soviet agents. Yet no evidence of sabotage has ever surfaced, and the condition of the guns contradicts the theory. The second theory holds that psychological breakdown among the crews, caused by exhaustion, cold, and the hopelessness of the war, rendered them incapable of action. But this too seems insufficient, as the silence was too orderly, too deliberate, to be explained by mass hysteria alone. The third theory, most unsettling of all, posits a secret agreement between German and Soviet authorities, a temporary ceasefire or stand-down in exchange for concessions elsewhere. This idea is supported by Allied intercepts referencing quiet corridors and unopposed passage, though these phrases remain ambiguous. Whatever the cause, the Gotenhafen batteries became a taboo subject in the early Cold War. Soviet investigators classified their findings under politically sensitive. German veterans avoided discussion. Western intelligence, though intrigued, quickly abandoned inquiry. By the mid-1950s, references to the incident vanished from official histories, replaced by the standard narrative of chaotic retreat. The silent guns had been buried not only under rubble, but under deliberate forgetting. Today, the ruins of the Gotenhafen emplacements lie beneath forests and industrial developments, their gun casemates flooded or sealed. Few visitors realize the mysteries they conceal. The silence of January 1945 still hangs over the site, a silence recorded in Soviet logs, German reports, and Allied intercepts, but never explained. The guns of Gotenhafen, once symbols of iron defense, became instead symbols of erasure. Fortifications that stood ready but chose, or were compelled, never to speak. Their story remains one of the most unnerving enigmas of the war, an absence of fire where thunder should have been, a silence that echoes still in the archives. Chapter 4. Stalin's Forbidden Pact of Lviv shadows in June 1941. The city of Lviv, then known as Lviv under Polish sovereignty, but occupied first by the Soviets and then the Germans, became a crucible of overlapping violence and shifting alliances. When Operation Barbarossa began on 22nd June, Wehrmacht units surged eastward, colliding with Soviet rearguards retreating chaotically through the streets. The city changed hands within days, leaving behind massacres, political reprisals, and layers of broken authority. Yet within the confusion, fragments of testimony and declassified intelligence reports point to an event even more unsettling: a covert negotiation, codenamed Protocol Schatten, between renegade elements of the Abwehr and operatives of the NKVD. If true, this Lviv Pact represented a forbidden moment of cooperation between mortal enemies, an agreement erased from both German and Soviet records, yet whispered about in intercepted cables and survivor accounts for decades. The first hints surfaced in 1974, when partial transcripts of KGB interrogations were briefly declassified during a bureaucratic shuffle in Moscow. One document described a meeting in late June 1941 within the confines of Lemberg, where NKVD officers, retreating under fire, allegedly handed over captured Polish resistance leaders to German intelligence in exchange for safe passage and material considerations. The transcript is fragmentary, with key sections redacted under the phrase "material destroyed 1953. Yet it contains specific details: the names of 2 Abwehr field officers, the outline of a draft agreement, and references to special oil consignments rerouted from Baku. Western analysts immediately recognized the implications. If Stalin's agents had indeed negotiated with Hitler's men in Lviv, it would shatter the carefully maintained narrative of absolute hostility following Barbarossa's launch. Survivor testimony adds weight to the possibility. Members of the Polish underground, the Armia Krajowa, recalled sudden ambushes during that summer in which their safe houses were betrayed simultaneously by both Germans and Soviets. One resistance fighter, interrogated by the OSS in 1943, insisted that information flowed between occupiers as though they shared the same files. Another survivor later claimed to have witnessed German and Soviet officers entering a commandeered townhouse in central Lviv together, emerging hours later without explanation. These accounts were long dismissed as unreliable, yet when cross-referenced with intercepted OSS cables, they reveal troubling consistency. The oil connection is particularly striking. German fuel shortages were acute by 1941, and Soviet oil from the Caucasus had been a lifeline during the brief period of cooperation under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. With war declared, such exchanges should have ceased. Yet Protocol Schatten, as it appears in the partial transcript, alludes to pipeline redirection and rail consignments under neutral guise. British analysts speculated that Soviet officials, desperate to slow the German advance and protect NKVD assets, may have considered limited barter to buy time. In return, the Germans allegedly agreed to share lists of captured Polish resistance figures, enabling coordinated suppression of partisan activity that threatened both regimes. If true, the cost was borne by the Poles, trapped between 2 occupiers who briefly set aside enmity to eliminate a common enemy. Official histories deny this possibility. Both Moscow and Berlin framed their confrontation in terms of total ideological war, leaving no space for compromise. Yet intelligence archives reveal cracks in this image. An OSS memorandum dated through to August 1941 refers to credible reports of local collusion between retreating Soviet units and advancing Abwehr operatives in the Lemberg sector. A British Foreign Office note from September that year echoes the claim, warning of potential clandestine arrangements that contradict stated policy. Neither document was ever intended for public release. Both were filed under restricted classification and only resurfaced decades later. The secrecy surrounding the Lviv Pact is telling. Unlike other battlefield mysteries, this one touches directly on the reputations of world powers. For the Soviet Union, acknowledgement of any cooperation with the Nazis after 22nd June 1941 would undermine the moral clarity of the Great Patriotic War. For Germany, admission of dealings with Stalin's agents during the invasion would reveal cracks in the myth of uncompromising conquest. For the Allies, exposing such a pact would complicate wartime propaganda that painted the Soviets as stalwart partners after Barbarossa. Silence served all sides. Fragments of Polish underground records, preserved in exile archives in London, add further intrigue. One report, dated July 1941, authored by a field officer of the WWII Union of Armed Struggle, states, "Our networks compromised in Lviv. Suspect double betrayal, possibly from combined Soviet-German exchange." The officer was executed by the Gestapo weeks later, yet his note survived, smuggled to London by courier. Historians long debated its meaning, dismissing the reference to combined betrayal as the product of confusion. But when viewed alongside Soviet transcripts and OSS cables, the phrase takes on new resonance. The legacy of Lviv's shadows persisted well into the Cold War. In 1951, during hearings of the US House Select Committee on Communist Aggression, émigré witnesses spoke haltingly of strange cooperation between Soviets and Germans in 1941. Their testimonies were dismissed at the time as exaggerations of traumatized refugees. Yet intelligence analysts quietly took note, filing references under code Shadow Protocol. Declassified CIA memoranda from the 1960s mention renewed interest in these claims, particularly as Polish émigré groups provided documents from wartime archives that hinted at exchanges of prisoners and intelligence in Lviv. Still, conclusive proof remains elusive. The documents that might confirm the Pact, the full transcript of the NKVD interrogation, the complete Abwehr field reports, the missing OSS files, are either destroyed or remain sealed. The very phrase "material destroyed 1953" appears across Soviet archival indexes like a scar, a deliberate erasure. Whether this destruction was routine or targeted remains a matter of debate. Some scholars argue it coincided with Stalin's death and Beria's purge of compromising materials. Others suggest it was part of a broader Cold War bargain, as the Soviet Union sought to control the narrative of the war in international forums. For the people of Lviv, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Resistance networks were decimated, leaders vanished, and trust was shattered. Caught between occupiers, civilians endured massacres, deportations, and the suffocating knowledge that both enemies may have briefly acted in unison against them. This memory lingered in whispered stories, in the bitterness of exile communities, and in the unspoken acknowledgement that betrayal came not only from one side, but from two. Today, the question of the Lviv Pact remains unresolved. Some historians dismiss it as conspiracy, a phantom conjured from overlapping atrocities and incomplete archives. Others, pointing to the recurring references across Allied, Soviet, and Polish sources, argue that too many coincidences exist for the story to be entirely false. The truth likely lies buried in still-sealed files, hidden in Moscow's Lubyanka or Berlin's Federal Archives. Until those records are opened, if they ever are, the shadows of Lviv remain, a forbidden chapter of the war where enemies became partners, if only for a moment, in betrayal. In the cold silence of military archives and intelligence vaults, unanswered questions continue to echo. 6 ships vanish without leaving wreckage. A prison is built that no map records, where captives enter but never return. Fortified guns stand ready yet fall inexplicably mute, abandoning thousands to their fate. And sworn enemies, drenched in each other's blood, meet in a ruined city to barter human lives and stolen oil. These fragments of history do not belong to legend or folklore. They are drawn from intercepted cables, declassified files, survivor testimony, and reports once stamped top secret by powers that preferred forgetting to remembering. Each case ends not with clarity, but with silence. Files closed prematurely, documents marked as destroyed, coordinates redacted, witnesses silenced. What unites them is the deliberate absence of resolution, the sense that behind every unexplained event stood a hand determined to bury it. Were these mysteries accidents of war, the fog of battle obscuring events? Or were they deliberate shadows, constructed by regimes whose survival depended on secrecy? As long as key archives remain sealed in Moscow, Washington, Berlin, and London, the answers remain locked away. Yet silence itself speaks volumes. It suggests that what was hidden threatened more than memory. It threatened the legitimacy of victors and vanquished alike. History's darkest chapters are not always those we read in textbooks, but those erased from them, buried where light cannot reach. These WWII enigmas endure whispering from the shadows, reminding us that some truths were never meant to be uncovered.